All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're all about those aha moments, right? Where things just click into place and you get a deeper understanding of the world. And today, we're taking on someone who definitely makes you think, someone who still stirs up a ton of discussion and debate in philosophy, Niccolo Machiavelli.
Yeah, you can't talk about power without Machiavelli coming up. I mean, this is a guy who lived in Florence from 1469 to 1527. And he wasn't some detached scholar, just theorizing from afar. He was right in the thick of things. He was the second chancellor of the Republic, a diplomat, and a prolific writer on everything from political theory to history, warfare, even literature. That real-world experience really shaped his ideas, which are often pretty bold, even shocking to some.
And that's what makes him so interesting, especially for a show like this. Like, why is Machiavelli even considered a part of the philosophical conversation? He didn't create some big systematic philosophy in the way others did. His work is all about drawing lessons from history, from real events.
That's right, and that's a key point. Machiavelli himself might not have called himself a philosopher in the traditional way. His writings aren't focused on abstract ideas. He's looking at how power works in practice, not just in theory. But that's exactly why he's so important, and why he's still so hotly debated in philosophy. He basically said, let's stop pretending and just look at how power really functions. And that was a huge challenge to the way people thought about politics back then. Philosophers are still trying to figure out if there's a systematic philosophy behind his practical advice, or if it's something else entirely.
So our goal today is to figure out how this guy who was almost an outsider to traditional philosophy became such a big deal, and why his ideas are still debated so much today. We're going to be using excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Niccolo Machiavelli. All right, let's jump right in. I think one of the things that makes Machiavelli so influential is that he turned conventional thinking about politics completely upside down.
Totally. Before Machiavelli, there were all these Mirror of Princes books, basically guides for rulers. They all said the same thing. A good ruler is a virtuous ruler. Be pious, just, merciful. Those moral qualities were seen as the basis of a stable and prosperous reign. It was all about linking legitimacy with how morally good the ruler was.
But Machiavelli comes along with the prince, and he just throws all that out the window. He says there's no real moral difference between legitimate and illegitimate power. Power is just the ability to make others do what you want, and a ruler's primary concern is getting power and holding on to it, or, as he put it, maintaining the state. It's a much more, cynical view, I guess you could say.
It's definitely a more pragmatic, even harsh view of politics. Machiavelli saw firsthand that just being a good person didn't mean you could hold on to power. He was working in the Florentine government, a very rough and tumble political environment where good intentions often got you nowhere. His big takeaway: moral goodness doesn't equal political success. He completely separates the way power is from the way it ought to be, which was revolutionary for his time.
And that realism shows up in how he talks about law and force. He acknowledged that good laws and a strong military are both important for keeping things stable, but he said flat out, since there cannot be good laws without good arms, I will not consider laws but speak of arms. Basically saying that force is what really matters. It's a very, in-your-face kind of statement.
Definitely. For Machiavelli, law is only effective if there's a credible threat of force behind it. Authority isn't based on some abstract right, but on the power to enforce your will, which is what led him to say, very controversially, that it's better for a ruler to be feared than loved. That comes straight from his pretty bleak view of human nature, which he saw as fundamentally self-interested.
Right, he called people ungrateful, disloyal, insincere, and deceitful. Not exactly a glowing recommendation for humanity. And he wrote that love as a bond can be broken whenever it's convenient, but fear, the fear of punishment, that's a much more reliable motivator. It's like he's saying political obligation has nothing to do with morals or duty. People obey simply because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark view of how political systems function. Machiavelli doesn't really talk about moral duty or anything like that. He just focuses on power and control, which is really different from the political philosophy that came before him. He basically says, forget about abstract ideas of legitimacy. Let's just focus on what actually makes people obey.
Okay, so we've got Machiavelli overturning traditional ideas about morality and power. Now let's get into two of his most famous concepts, virtù and fortuna. I mean, these words have become almost synonymous with Machiavelli, but they have very specific meanings in his work, right?
They really do. When Machiavelli talks about virtue, especially when it comes to a prince, he's not talking about being a nice guy or a saint. He's not talking about traditional virtues. He's talking about the skills, the qualities, the abilities a ruler needs to hold on to power and achieve great things. It's more about being effective than being good. It's almost like having a kind of political savvy, the ability to navigate a very complex and unpredictable world.
So it's more about being strategic, even cunning, being able to do whatever it takes to achieve political goals, even if those actions aren't exactly morally admirable.
Right. Machiavelli says virtue is a flexible disposition. It's about being able to change your approach, to act in ways that might be considered good or bad, depending on what the situation calls for. He even compares it to being a general on the battlefield, where you have to constantly adapt to changing circumstances.
Yeah.
It's all about practical wisdom and knowing which strategies will work best in any given moment.
And then we have fortuna, which often gets translated as fortune or luck, but it's way more than that in Machiavelli's writings. There's a real sense of like a powerful force, often a negative force at play.
Yeah, definitely. Fortuna isn't just random chant. It's much more active, almost like a force of nature that constantly threatens to disrupt order and stability. It's the wild card in politics, the unpredictable element that even the most skilled ruler has to contend with. It's kind of like the ancient idea of a capricious goddess, but even more powerful and chaotic.
I mean, he describes it in The Prince like a raging river that can overwhelm everything in its path. But then he also says that even a raging river can be managed, right? You can build dams and channels to control the flow. So he's not saying Fortuna is totally unbeatable.
Exactly. He argues that fortuna can be partially controlled through preparation, through foresight, through wisdom, and you guessed it, virtue. But then he goes on to make this rather infamous comparison of Fortuna to a woman.
Yeah, the whole woman thing is really controversial. Machiavelli says that Fortuna is like a woman who needs to be dominated, to be treated forcefully, to be kept in check. And he even says it's better to be bold and impetuous in dealing with Fortuna than cautious. That's definitely a difficult metaphor to grapple with.
No question. It's a metaphor that's been criticized a lot, but it shows how Machiavelli saw Fortuna as this primal, irrational force that disrupts reason and order. Virtue, then, becomes about being able to confront and overcome this chaotic element, even if that means acting in ways that go against traditional morality. Which, of course, leads us to the big question: what was Machiavelli's own view of morality?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. Was he actually endorsing evil? Was he just indifferent to morality? Or was there something else going on? This is where things get really tricky with Machiavelli.
It's a question that scholars have been debating for centuries. There's a whole range of interpretations. Some, like Leo Strauss, called him straight up a teacher of evil. Others, like Benedetto Croce, saw him as a pure realist. He understood, they say, that sometimes you have to set aside traditional ethics to deal with the realities of power. And then there's Quentin Skinner, who has a more nuanced view. He says that for Machiavelli, resorting to immoral actions was a last resort. Ideally, a ruler would act morally, but they had to be ready to do bad things if it meant protecting the state. So there's no easy answer here.
And then you've got this other interpretation, the Machiavelli as scientist view. This was popular for a while. It basically argued that Machiavelli was just trying to describe how power works, like a scientist observing a natural phenomenon. He wasn't making moral judgments, he was just presenting the facts.
Yeah, that interpretation definitely had its moment. It tried to show him as a kind of founder of modern political science, separating the descriptive from the normative, trying to figure out the laws of politics, so to speak. But that view's not as popular anymore, though his focus on realism is still really important for how we study politics.
And it's interesting to think about some of the counter-arguments, too. Like, Rousseau argued that The Prince wasn't actually a how-to guide for tyrants. He thought it was more like satire, exposing how immoral and corrupt tyrannical rule really is. And some scholars even think Machiavelli was deliberately giving bad advice to rulers as a way of subtly undermining them.
Yeah, those alternative readings definitely add another layer of complexity to how we understand Machiavelli. The satirical view suggests he wasn't being entirely serious, while the Trap the Prince theory gives his writings a much more subversive edge. And when you look at some of his other work, like his comedies, it's clear he was capable of irony and satire.
And then you have his views on religion, which were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly orthodox. He was pretty critical of Christianity, especially the institutional church. And he seemed to really admire the old pagan religions, especially those that were closely tied to the state.
Yeah, that's definitely something that stands out. especially in the discourses, where he's very critical of the church for weakening civic virtue and being too focused on the afterlife. That's led some people to conclude he was basically anti-Christian. He saw those pagan religions, especially the Roman ones, as being much more aligned with the strong and powerful state. Some scholars even go as far as to say his entire worldview was pagan.
But then there are others who argue that his religious views were actually more complex. They say he might have been conventionally pious, or maybe he even had deep Christian themes hidden in his work. So there's a whole lot of disagreement about what he really believed.
It's a tough one to pin down. Some scholars, like de Grazia, point to biblical allusions and suggest he saw history unfolding according to a divine plan. Others, like Naderman, look at how he uses theological ideas like grace and free will in his political theories. And Viroli emphasizes the particular religious context of Florence at that time. So, figuring out Machiavelli's true religious beliefs is still a big open question.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about his idea of the state. He's often given credit for coming up with the modern concept of the state as a distinct entity with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a defined territory.
Right. Thinkers like Quentin Skinner make a strong case for that interpretation. They point to his frequent use of the term lo Stato, especially in The Prince, and how he connects it to the acquisition and use of coercive power. And the whole doctrine of reason of state, which says the state can do things that would be considered immoral for an individual, owes a lot to Machiavelli.
But then you have Harvey Mansfield, who offers a totally different perspective. He argues that Machiavelli's state is more like a personal possession, closer to that old medieval idea of dominium. It's like the prince owns the state. It's not some abstract entity separate from the ruler.
Right. For Mansfield, Machiavelli is still thinking in terms of personal rule. Governance is all about the personal qualities of the ruler, the virtue we talked about earlier. So whether his idea of the state really lines up with modern understandings is still up for debate.
And the Machiavellian prince himself is an interesting character. He usually comes to power not through inheritance or election, but through his own abilities, his virtue.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have that automatic legitimacy that comes with a hereditary title or a popular mandate.
Exactly. He's always on shaky ground because his power depends entirely on his ability to deal with whatever Fortuna throws at him. And of course, he's got to watch out for all those political rivals who are constantly trying to take him down.
It's a precarious position to be in, always having to prove yourself. And it makes you wonder if Machiavelli really believed that a ruler could ever have the perfect virtue to handle all those challenges.
I think he might have had his doubts. He talks about how this ideal new prince would need a really adaptable psychology, able to switch between good and bad as needed, almost effortlessly. But he never really gives a clear historical example of a ruler who fits that description. And when he gives advice, it's often phrased in a very conditional way, like he recognizes that humans just aren't built for that kind of constant flexibility.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the prince, but let's move on to the discourses on Livy. A lot of people see this as a much more overtly Republican work compared to the prince. Like maybe it shows his true political beliefs more clearly.
Yeah, that's a common interpretation, and I think it's fair to say that the discourses does suggest a stronger preference for Republican government. He seems to distinguish between two different types of political order. There's the minimal kind, which he calls vivere securo, basically living securely under a strong, balanced government. But then there's the more ideal kind, which he calls vivere libero, or living freely, with active participation and political engagement. And he definitely leans towards the second type, which he says is best achieved in a republic. So it's not just about being safe, it's about having the freedom to shape your own political destiny.
He even uses the French monarchy as an example, right? He praises the legal system and how the Parlement limits the king's power, but he still says that France isn't truly free. It's more like a well-managed but not fully participatory system.
Exactly. Machiavelli admired how orderly and law-abiding France was, but he felt it fell short of true liberty, which, for him, required something more than just being protected by good laws. He thought people often confused security with true freedom, and that even a good king could only provide the former. The latter required a more active role for the people.
So for Machiavelli, it wasn't enough to just have a benevolent ruler who kept things peaceful and orderly. He thought true liberty required citizens to be actively involved in shaping the laws and policies that govern them.
Right. He believed that a king could ensure security through law, but only a republic could foster the kind of active participation that leads to true liberty. He even points to the French monarchy's decision to disarm its people as evidence of this. He argues that while this might have made it easier for the king to control the population, it ultimately weakened the state by making it reliant on mercenaries and creating a passive citizenry.
And he contrasts that with the Roman Republic, where the citizens' willingness to defend their city-state was seen as essential to its freedom. He writes, so Rome was free 400 years and was armed. Sparta, 800. Many other cities have been unarmed and free less than 40 years. That's a pretty clear statement about the connection between a citizen militia and liberty.
It's a crucial part of his Republican vision. He believed that an armed citizenry was the best defense against tyranny, both from within and from outside forces. And get this, he even argues that the conflicts between the nobility and the common people in Rome, the famous tumults that we often think of as destabilizing, were actually essential to its long-lasting liberty. He saw that tension as productive, as something that ultimately led to better laws and a stronger republic.
I mean, that's a pretty counterintuitive idea, right? He's saying that these internal conflicts, which a lot of people blame for Rome's eventual downfall, actually kept it free and strong for so long. He saw that constant push and pull between different factions as the key to creating a truly free society.
It was a dynamic he saw as essential. He thought that republics, with their built-in mechanisms for conflict and debate, were inherently better at adapting and innovating than more rigid systems like monarchies, which might explain why he wasn't as impressed by other famous republics like Sparta and Venice, which he felt were too focused on stability and control, even if they were successful in their own ways.
So we see Machiavelli placing a lot of faith in the people, in their capacity for both liberty and good judgment. He even says, a people is more prudent, more stable, and of better judgment than a prince. That's a pretty bold claim, especially coming from the guy who wrote The Prince.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes him so fascinating. He saw the people as being more invested in preserving liberty because for them, it meant not being oppressed. They had a more direct stake in making sure things were run fairly.
And that connects to his emphasis on public speech and debate in republics. He saw these as the primary ways of resolving disputes and figuring out the best course of action, like a kind of public forum where everyone could have their say and the best ideas would win out.
Absolutely. He recognized the importance of rhetoric in a free society, and he even believed that conflict, or light, as he called it, was essential to that process. He thought that open debate and vigorous argumentation, even if they got heated, were ultimately the best way for a republic to make good decisions. And he contrasted that with the closed systems of monarchies, where decisions were made by a single ruler, often without much input from anyone else.
He was very much a believer in the wisdom of the crowds, even going so far as to quote that old saying, Vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. He thought the people collectively were pretty good at recognizing the truth and making sound judgments, especially when it came to choosing leaders. He even claimed that the people were much less likely to appoint corrupt officials than a prince would be, which is pretty interesting coming from him.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of irony there. But he really believed that republics, with their reliance on open debate and persuasion, were much more likely to make good decisions than systems that relied on force and coercion. He even writes, to cure the malady of the people, words are enough. But no one can speak to a wicked prince, and the only remedy is steel. That's a pretty powerful image, contrasting the power of words in a republic with the violence that often characterizes other forms of government.
And this preference for republics seems to tie in with his skepticism about any single individual, even a prince, being able to consistently maintain the virtue needed to handle all the challenges of political life.
Right, he saw that reliance on a single ruler as a potential weakness, especially in times of crisis. He thought republics, with their diversity of perspectives and talents, were much more adaptable. He famously uses the example of the Roman Republic's war against Hannibal. Rome had both Fabius Maximus, known for his cautious strategy of delaying tactics, and Scipio Africanus, who was much more aggressive and favored direct confrontation. He argues that the Republic could utilize the strengths of both leaders, whereas a monarchy might have been stuck with a ruler whose personality was ill-suited for the situation at hand. He writes, if Fabius had been king of Rome, he might easily have lost this war. Since, however, he was born in a republic, it came about that, just as it had a Fabius. So later it had a Scipio.
So he's saying that the diversity of talent in a republic makes it more resilient, more capable of adapting to different challenges. But he also points out that republics have their own limitations. They tend to be slow to change, and sometimes they only adapt when they're forced to by a major crisis.
Exactly. While the diversity of viewpoints is a strength, the established institutions of a republic can be very resistant to change. That creates a different kind of tension within the Republican model. And it brings us back to this big question about the relationship between the prince and the discourses. Did Machiavelli really favor republics? Or was he just being pragmatic? Did he see princely rule as a necessary evil in certain circumstances? It's a debate that's still going on.
It's a fascinating puzzle, and Machiavelli never really tells us definitively what he believed. Some scholars think the prince was just a product of its time, maybe a way for him to try and get back into the Medici's good graces. But others think it reflects a genuine belief that a strong ruler, even a ruthless one, might be necessary in certain situations. Maybe the best approach is to accept that there are multiple Machiavellis, as some scholars suggest, and to try and understand the complexity of his thought without forcing it into a neat little box. And that brings us to his legacy, to his place in Western thought. He's often hailed as a founder of modern political thought, but he's also deeply rooted in classical political philosophy.
Machiavelli's impact is huge, and there's a ton of scholarship on it. Scholars like Pocock and Rahi have traced his influence on the development of Republican ideas in the West, even on the American Constitution. And the Neo-Roman school of thought draws heavily on his concept of freedom as non-domination, applying his insights to contemporary debates about democracy. But just how original his ideas really were and what his true legacy is are still very much up for debate.
Some have argued that Machiavelli was caught between two worlds, between innovation and tradition. He drew from both the via antiqua, the old ways of thinking, and the via moderna, the new ways. That tension might explain why his work is so ambiguous and open to so many different interpretations.
That's a good point. Maybe it's not about contradictions or inconsistencies, but about trying to make sense of a world that was changing rapidly. Machiavelli was trying to balance those old ideas with new realities, and the result is a body of work that's both challenging and enduringly relevant. He's not easily categorized as either purely ancient or modern. As the scholar Padula puts it, he's like Janus, the Roman god with two faces, looking both to the past and the future.
So, in this deep dive, we've tried to give you, our philosophically minded listeners, a better understanding of this complex and controversial figure. We've looked at how he challenged traditional political philosophy, unpacked his key concepts of virtu and fortuna, explored his views on morality and religion, and compared his contrasting perspectives on principalities and republics. And we've touched on the ongoing debate about his legacy and the many ways he continues to influence political thought. Hopefully, there have been a few aha moments along the way, helping you see this influential thinker in a new light.
For sure. Engaging with Machiavelli, even centuries later, forces us to confront some really fundamental questions about power, leadership, and the nature of the state. His writings are a constant reminder that politics is a messy business and that easy answers are hard to come by.
And to wrap things up, we want to leave you with a question to ponder. Given the tensions and apparent contradictions in Machiavelli's work, especially between the prince and the discourses, what do you think his ultimate vision for an ideal political order was? And why do you think his work continues to spark such intense debate in philosophical circles, even after all these years? We encourage you to keep exploring Machiavelli's own writings and the vast scholarship surrounding them. There's always something new to discover, and his ideas are sure to keep us thinking and arguing for centuries to come. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.